if you were advising Dr. Ford ahead of this massive day, what would you tell her?
Well, the first thing I would tell her is to be herself. The most important thing here for the public to see, it's not just the senators, it's also the public, is who she is. Because a lot of the conversation that's happening around this confirmation hearing has turned to credibility, obviously. There's a lot of information we won't get in this hearing about credibility because other witnesses are not being called, because the FBI background check has not been reopened. So since it's really what she is going to say and what Brett Kavanaugh is going to say, the question becomes, who is she? Let the public see who she is so that folks can feel like they know what kind of person she is. Unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because this isn't the litmus test for whether or not someone gets a job promotion, but unfortunately it's become about the people as opposed to the position. And we have to remind our audience, this is not a trial. There is no, we're not talking about a criminal case. It's a job interview. Republicans, Elise, brought in Rachel Mitchell to do the questioning. And earlier this week, I couldn't understand it, why they're saying we need to do this for optics. If optics was their priority, they could have said years ago, maybe we should try to elect more women. But is it a positive in that we're going to get less grandstanding? She's there to ask questions.
Well, Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana was on Morning Joe yesterday, and he explained that they decided to make this decision to keep the circus atmosphere down, and that was something that Dr. Ford's, her attorneys had encouraged because they didn't want the grandstanding, the political campaigning that had dominated the first hearing. And so while understandably it's upsetting that senators themselves are not questioning Dr. Ford because that is their job, hopefully it will keep the tempo down a little bit if that is remotely possible.
But given that she's there, you know, she has a prosecutor's background, doesn't she need more questions answered? Wouldn't an investigation help her actually get her job done today?
Exactly. I think an investigation is exactly what is needed in this particular instance. Listen, she has made some very strong allegations against Brett Kavanaugh, and they appear to be credible. There's a likelihood that they're credible. And what you do in that instance is often open an investigation. And I can't understand why Brett Kavanaugh wouldn't want an investigation, and I can't understand why these senators who sit on this Judiciary Committee wouldn't want an investigation, because what that does is it gives this entire process legitimacy. And their inability to do that, I think, takes away from what it is that they're trying to accomplish, which is to have Brett Kavanaugh ascend to the Supreme Court without an air of illegitimacy, with strength, with conviction, and so forth.
Then, Andrea, what do you believe Republican senators are looking for today? And do they have open minds? Because it was only just a few days ago, Orrin Hatch giving us the Dr. Ford must be mixed up. But do you think they're actually listening?
I think there are a handful of Republican senators who are listening, and they're not just on the Judiciary Committee. There are a number of others whom I know of that Mitch McConnell does not have nailed down yet. He's projecting confidence that he has the votes on the floor as this gets out of committee. He's already scheduling it, trying to push it through, giving the aura of inevitability. But I think there are a number of Republicans and some key Democrats as well from red states who the Republicans felt would be forced to go with Kavanaugh, who are also looking for any kind of political cover here, an excuse not to go ahead with it. One thing that gets back to what you were saying is that this is really all now not so much about facts, but about the presentations and the way these two people appear, not only to the people on the committee, but to the American people. When I was covering Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill 27 years ago, after the first day, we thought Anita Hill had just sold her story. She was so authentic, so credible. Then they brought Clarence Thomas in, and when he said, you know, this is nothing but a high-tech lynching, there was this moment. And by Saturday night, Sunday morning, when I was on Meet the Press, even some of the liberal Democratic senators had clearly been backed off. They had done overnight polling, and they had decided that the American people were deciding with him. It was a classic he said, she said, and that's when they decided, the majority Democrats decided not to let her introduce her polygraph test, not to let her introduce a key corroborating witness that she had. So that's when they decided to short circuit the whole thing.
But this is why many people are saying Republicans don't have open minds here. It doesn't have to be a he said, she said. They could open a brief investigation. You know, when you look at the new allegations, whether it's from Dr. Ford, Debbie Ramirez, or the allegations we've seen in the last 24 hours, there are as many questions, if not more, than there are answers. Why wouldn't people want them answered?
I mean, I think what everyone at this table would say is this could have been resolved potentially with Mark Judge, but they're so afraid to call him. The fact that they did not, in a case like this, an issue like this, call someone who was in the room. How often in a sexual assault case or an allegation do you have a witness and even a participant, a third person? It's so rare. And so to not have had done any kind of interrogation of him, even if it's not on camera, just some sort of affidavit with committee staff, preferably with the FBI, is really malfeasance.
If not for politics, for Brett Kavanaugh and his family's own name. I found it striking when Brett Kavanaugh and his wife Ashley did the Fox News interview the other night, and his wife was directly asked, would you want an FBI investigation to clear your husband's name? She looked at her husband. He took the question and pivoted and didn't answer.
And this is so confusing because I think everyone can have complete sympathy with Brett Kavanaugh saying, I want the opportunity to clear my name. But the way you clear your name is by having neutral, nonpartisan, trained investigators dig into all of the witnesses who are now identifying themselves around his behavior. And remember that Michael Avenatti last night said criminal charges. Those words came out of his mouth.
Andrea, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Andrea Mitchell. I want to bring in another strong woman, Nina Totenberg, into the conversation, NPR's legal affairs correspondent. She broke the story of Anita Hill's allegations against Clarence Thomas back in 1991. Nina, I want to play part of what the president said about all of this yesterday.
Well, it does impact my opinion. You know why? Because I've had a lot of false charges made against me. People want fame, they want money, they want whatever. So when I see it, I view it differently than somebody sitting home watching television where they say, oh, Judge Kavanaugh, this or that. It's happened to me many times. So when you say, does it affect me in terms of my thinking with respect to Judge Kavanaugh? Absolutely, because I've had it many times.
Wow. Nina, can you decode that for us? What is the president saying?
He's saying, I've had this happen to me, and he never says I was innocent. He said he identifies with Kavanaugh in this battle. At the same time, he also said, well, I'm going to be watching too, and I'm going to see, and we'll see, in the famous Trumpian words. And that is not the kind of full-throated endorsement that the nominee has gotten without equivocation over the previous days. The translation of that, I think, was, well, let's see how she does and he does, and if it gets not good for us, I'm willing to pull the plug.
Midwin, I want to share what Kavanaugh has even said in the last 24 hours, because he's changing his story a bit when it comes to character. Because, again, this is a job interview for the highest court in the land, and it is about how you conduct yourself. Here's what he said on Monday.
Yes, there were parties, and the drinking age was 18, and yes, the seniors were legal and had beer there. And yes, people might have had too many beers on occasion, and people generally in high school, I think all of us have probably done things we look back on in high school and regret or cringe a bit.
Now, this morning, he will testify that, quote, I drank beer with my friends. Sometimes I had too many. I said and did things in high school that make me cringe now. Is that an important distinction? Because when he did that Fox News interview, he certainly painted a very innocent choir boy persona. My only priorities: schoolwork, community service, church, and basketball. And after that interview, in addition to new accusations, you saw people who had signed letters of support withdraw their support. One woman who was in an advertisement that was put out supporting him said, you know what, I'm going to need you to stop running that. And it sounds like maybe he's adjusting his position.
It does sound like he's adjusting his position, and I think overall he is not consistent with his position. And if you're not consistent with your position, guess what? You're not credible. And he, right now, at this very moment, needs to be credible. As you've said, this is a job interview. This is not something that he ought to be expected to have. And I think one of the things that we've noticed throughout this entire process up to this point is that there seems to have been this sort of fait accompli in the way that this has been handled. In other words, listen, the job is already yours. But that's not how it's supposed to be. You're supposed to prove that you have the character, that you have the temerity, and that you were fit for the job that's ahead of you. That really is the burden that is upon him, the onus that's upon him. And so for him to sort of be waffling and going back and forth about who he was, what he did during that time, it doesn't make him credible.
Elise, is it not about how he's conducting himself and what he's doing this week? Understanding the difference between right and wrong. Many people are saying, are you really going to go after someone for what they did when they were 17 years old? Is it about that, or is it about how he's managing today and how he views his conduct when he was 17?
Well, first of all, I think it's a bit of an understatement to call this a job interview at this point. This is full-blown political warfare. This is a battlefield unlike any we've really seen in the Trump era.
So he can't go back to district court after this?
I think he should be able to, but that's, well, let's see. Actually, no, I want to hear what's said today. I'm like the American public. I want to hear what both sides had today. And I think that's the problem. Everyone in this country has become so quick to assume the worst about our political enemies. It's something that we constantly have to check. And when you have a week where accusations of a Supreme Court nominee being involved in a criminal gang raping, drugging, sex ring in high school are surfacing, the political debate is no longer a job interview. It is a full-blown battlefield.
Well, I can disagree with that respectfully. I think it is still a job interview. And I think this job interview would go quite well if you just had a sort of neutral, as Maya mentioned, neutral, impartial investigation. That really will quell this sort of circus.
And that has been the political,
that is,
if Brett Kavanaugh is not confirmed, and it is not because of the testimony today, it will be because of the failure for there have been to be a full investigation.
I want to stay on the new allegations that we've seen in the last 24 hours. Nina, I want to read part of what the New York Times Ed Board wrote about the allegations from Julie Swetnick. Quote, these are grotesque charges, and like the previous ones, they leave oceans of room for speculation and doubt. This is precisely why the Senate needs to stop trying to ram through this nomination by some arbitrary deadline and arrange for a thorough and nonpartisan inquiry. It's very different to remind our audience it's an arbitrary deadline. Today is meaningless. Chuck Grassley chose tomorrow as the date. And while everyone can poke holes at these new allegations from Swetnick saying, hold on, what does it mean to say that Brett Kavanaugh was present? What does it mean? How do you know it was him who spiked a drink? What's the argument to not slow things down?
Well, the argument is, frankly, a political one. I asked a Democrat who's handled high-profile confirmation battles, and I said to him, if this were you, forget all the facts here. If this were you, would you be pressing for a quick vote? And he said yes, because time is not on their side. They've got a very short timeline, and after that, they totally lose control. And you see that in some measure by the release of information at the very last minute. You see that by the fact that they haven't sworn their witnesses. You see the release of they have a couple of guys who say it may have been us. Have they referred that to the Montgomery County Police Department if somebody's confessing to a crime? Did they take the testimony under oath? Did they do it jointly with the Democrats? The answer to all of those questions, I think, is no.
Time might not be on their side, but is the truth on their side? And if the truth is on their side, should time matter? This is a lifetime appointment, but it's also Brett Kavanaugh's legacy.
You know, absolutely. And, you know, one of the things we've seen over the past 24 hours is, since there are new allegations, and I think we need to be very fair to Brett Kavanaugh on this one point, Julie Swetnick, who is Michael Avenatti's client, did not actually say explicitly in her affidavit that he participated in the gang rape.
And we have to be very careful how that gets reported.
We have to be very careful about that. She did put him in the room, which suggests that he certainly didn't try to stop it. If she's telling
Did she put him in the room or at the party?
It's a little unclear, and I think, but this goes back to the primary point. They are serious allegations. They are serious as to his character. They are serious in terms of, as someone who's saying, I will sit in the highest court in the land responsible for upholding the law and following the law, to understand what happened here. The reality, though, in terms of the politics of this, is the Republicans had a choice to ask him to pull back and say, I'm out, in order to put up a candidate that could be put through with sufficient time.
But if Brett Kavanaugh withdrew on his own, isn't that like a tacit admission of guilt?
I was speaking to the politics as opposed to his personal position. Doesn't mean he would have. Right. But I think why it still comes back to why he didn't ask for a reopening of his background check. And he could have done that over a week ago, and we could have made significant progress. He also chose to go on public television, you know, on Fox News, which was a highly unusual move. And I think one of the reasons we've seen these allegations coming forward is including friends of his from college saying, I'm his friend, and I'm telling you he would drink to excess and lose.
That is what was stunning to me. He did a Fox News interview on a platform friendly to him, and the outcome was some of his allies saying, I'm going to withdraw support. Elise?
But that was the second big mistake of the week, after not pushing the FBI to come in and investigate. Having Judge Kavanaugh go out on Fox News, a partisan outlet, and it sacrificed what he himself has made his big message, that he is to be a referee, that he is not for one side or for the other. And so by the White House pushing him to do that interview that he and his wife participated in, it was a colossal fail, because then that illusion of not being politicized was sacrificed for going on Fox News and attracting a base that was already there with him.
But deja vu all over again. Nina, we just saw Chuck Grassley walk into the room. He was in that room for the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearing, and here we are for you, who was covering it back then, and here you are covering it today. What's the most important thing you'll be listening for?
Well, I guess I'll be listening for a sense of telling the truth and who is believable and how both witnesses are treated, especially her, because she's not part of this process. She says in her prepared testimony that she's terrified and that she really didn't want to come forward. But that she wanted the information out. You know, this is a classic view of somebody who isn't part of the process. I want my information out, but I don't want my name attached to it. And as any responsible journalist will tell you, you really can't do that. And Anita Hill wanted to do that too. But once the moment comes where it's fish or cut bait, you either put your name on it and it's important enough to you as a citizen, and she says it is, and you come forward, or you don't. And I think these will be very dramatic hearings. I don't know how this business of having a female prosecutor will turn out. It may turn out okay for the Republicans, or they may look like ciphers, or they may not be able to stop talking.
Well, Nina, thank you so much. We are watching the room as it fills up. Chuck Grassley making his way in. It will certainly be an historic day on Capitol Hill. And we will be watching this hearing. Brett Kavanaugh will be speaking first. His accuser, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, who has arrived. We don't see her in the room yet. She will be testifying second. Midwin, while it is not unheard of, it is very rare for women to come forward with false accusations. What is at stake? What kind of position has Dr. Ford put herself in?
Well, you know, I've worked with sex crime victims and women who have been victims of violent crime, domestic violence. And one of the things that I find most astonishing about her coming forward is that she is brave. She's a very brave woman to do this. She has nothing to gain. She clearly recognized what sort of scorn she'd be facing. I think we all know what happened with Anita Hill 27 years ago. But I think she's going to be facing questions about who she is, who is her character, what is her credibility, and what is it that she has to prove here.
We're seeing Chuck Grassley making his way in. He just spoke to reporters for a moment. We didn't get that sound. We'll try to bring that back for you in just a moment. Victims' rights advocates, Maya, are certainly trying to separate the politics from the accusations here. The most recent accusations, Michael Avenatti is in the mix. And while we know nobody can throw bombs and get the attention like Michael Avenatti can, much like Donald Trump, does it hurt? Does it hurt Dr. Ford? Does it hurt these other women to make a choice like Avenatti? Because he is hyper-political. I mean, not long ago, he was in Iowa. Some people say this guy wants to run for president.
Yeah. Well, and he has said he could beat Donald Trump. I think that the important thing here is, one, people get to choose their own lawyers. So obviously Julie Zolnick had the opportunity to decide who she wanted to represent her. I think it is unfortunate that it further politicizes what should be significantly less political, which is the issue of what happened here and what happened to very real people. Her allegations are quite stunning. I think one thing that's very clear in them is that they corroborate a type of behavior, right? And she's not the only one to corroborate this type of behavior, including, as we've heard, even friends of Judge Kavanaugh's who've come forward and said, yeah, that is actually the way he behaved. He drank a lot, and sometimes. So that part of it should not get lost when we're thinking about credibility. Credibility doesn't actually establish all the facts, but certainly Dr. Ford is walking into that room with a lot of corroboration of aspects of her story about how he behaves. And that shouldn't, unfortunately, the Michael Avenatti aspects to that can help kind of paper over the fact that there is that type of corroboration about behavior, which in the context of someone who's going to be sitting in the Supreme Court does matter. Not necessarily whether there's guilt in a criminal context, but certainly in terms of the character of someone who's going to be sitting in the Supreme Court.
And it goes back to Judge Kavanaugh in his Fox interview this week, voluntarily painting himself to look so very innocent, voluntarily talking about the time in which he lost his virginity. To me, I'm going, what is he telling us? And then following that, you've got other Yale students saying, well, he didn't tell me that back in the 80s. Elise, did the most recent accuser, Julie Swetnick, need a Michael Avenatti-style attorney? Because Debbie Ramirez's attorney was on Rachel Maddow the other night saying they can't even get a call back from Republicans. And we know that Avenatti gets all the attention he wants.
Well, and having Michael Avenatti as her attorney is a political gift to partisans who want to attack him as trying to milk this for attention, and they want to detract from what the actual accusations are. Which, keep in mind, the accusations in that affidavit are explosive.
Yes.
If those accusations are true, they are accusations of a criminal drug date rape lineup conspiracy that potentially affected hundreds of women in the early 80s in Maryland. It will be one of the biggest sex crimes in the history of this country.
Well, we need to step back a little bit, because where I'll disagree is not the culture. Unfortunately, is one in which there's way too much violence against women and girls. And we know that if you're between 16 and 19, you're 4 times more likely to be the victim of a sexual crime. So that's number one. So it's not about whether there was a conspiracy. It's more about whether there was a culture of behavior. And did Brett Kavanaugh participate in that culture
and if
of behavior and continue
he can
to
recognize that was bad behavior back in the 80s and things must be very different now. But to blanketly deny it, if the accusations pile up, could be worrisome.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.